The square was crowded, the winter air biting cold, but no one left. They pressed forward, peasants and nobles alike, eager to witness the hand of God at work. A man stood in the center, trembling, his eyes darting between the iron bar, glowing red in the fire, and the priest who murmured prayers beside it. Today, his guilt or innocence would not be decided by argument, by witness, or by reason. It would be decided by heaven. If he carried the iron and his wounds healed clean, he would walk free. If they festered, he would hang. The crowd hushed, believing that in the next heartbeat, God himself would reveal his judgment. This was the essence of medieval justice, not the weighing of evidence, not the deliberation of jurors, but the belief that the Almighty ruled every breath of the world, even the smallest quarrel in a village. In the Middle Ages, truth was too sacred to be left to human minds. Only God could truly see into the heart of man. Thus, ordeals by fire, water, or combat became the highest courts of all. It was faith dressed in ritual, belief made flesh in pain and fear. Yet one cannot help but wonder, was this truly justice from heaven, or a theater of fear designed by men? The priest who blessed the iron, the Lord who demanded the trial, the crowd who watched in awe, all placed their trust in the unseen hand of God. But in truth, it was human hands that set the fire, tied the ropes, declared the verdict. The line between divine will and human ambition blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. For the accused, there was no escape from this dreadful gamble. A woman accused of stealing a loaf of bread, a man accused of cursing his neighbor, a servant whispered to be a heretic, all were cast into the same rituals, their fates bound to the flames, the water, or the duel. Fear of injustice weighed on them, yet the belief was so absolute that many accepted the ordeal as fair. If they were innocent, surely God would save them. If not, perhaps they deserved the punishment. In that strange submission lay both comfort and despair. And the people, how eagerly they came. To them, these trials were proof that God was not distant, not silent, but active in their lives. When the iron seared flesh, when water swallowed a body, when steel clashed in a duel, the villagers saw not only human suffering, but divine judgment unfolding before their eyes. They went home whispering of miracles or curses, convinced they had glimpsed the eternal hand of heaven. But if one looks closer, questions emerge. Was every wound that healed a sign of innocence, or the blessing of careful bandages applied by sympathetic priests? Was every duel won by the righteous, or by the stronger, better-armed combatant? Did every drowning prove guilt, or did it only prove that a bound man could not breathe underwater? To the medieval mind, these questions did not shake belief. To us, they reveal the uneasy truth. Perhaps it was men who pretended to speak for God, cloaking their judgments in the robes of heaven. Still, to condemn these rituals outright would be to misunderstand the world that birthed them. Medieval society was not irrational, but profoundly ordered by its faith. In a world without modern courts, without forensic science, without the presumption of innocence, what alternative was there? To them, it seemed safer to entrust justice to God than to the bias of lords or the lies of men. It was not cruelty they sought, but certainty, a certainty only the divine could provide. Thus, the Middle Ages posed a haunting paradox. In seeking the justice of God, men created systems that were brutal, flawed, and often unjust. Yet within them lay a deep yearning for fairness, for truth that transcended human weakness. And so we return to the question that will guide our journey. Did God truly rule medieval justice? Or was it always human hands pretending, draping their power in the veil of heaven? Step into a medieval village, and you will find no courthouse with judges in powdered wigs, no juries to debate guilt, no lawyers to weave arguments. Instead, you will find faith raw, unshakable faith that God himself sat in judgment over the accused. The medieval world believed that heaven's will permeated every corner of existence, and justice was too important to be left to flawed mortals. Thus was born the terrifying concept of the ordeal, a trial not of words, but of fire, water, and miracle, in which the Almighty alone would reveal the truth. At the heart of this belief was a simple conviction. God could not be deceived. Witnesses might lie, lords might scheme, even priests might falter, but the Creator saw all. If an innocent man touched flame, surely heaven would spare him. If a guilty man swore falsely, surely God would expose him. These ordeals were called judicium Dei, the judgment of God, and they were held with solemn reverence, wrapped in sacred ritual, to ensure that no one doubted their divine authority. The ordeal by fire was one of the most feared. A man might be ordered to carry a bar of iron heated until it glowed white, or walk barefoot across burning coals. His wounds were then bound by priests, sealed, and examined days later. If they healed without infection, God had vindicated him. If they festered, the verdict was guilt. To the villagers who gathered to watch, this was not barbarity, but certainty. God's hand was in the healing, his judgment clear for all to see. Others faced the ordeal of water. Here, the accused was bound and lowered into a river or pond that had been blessed as holy. If the waters received the body, pulling it gently beneath the surface, it was proof of innocence. If the waters rejected him, causing him to float, it was a sign of guilt. The symbolism was clear. The consecrated water, representing purity, would not bear the weight of sin. But the irony was cruel. Sometimes the innocent sank too deep, drowning before they could be pulled up again. And yet, even then, people whispered that heaven's justice had been served. Still more mysterious was the ordeal of the morsel, in which a priest placed a piece of sacred bread or cheese into the mouth of the accused, commanding him to swallow. If he choked, it was proof of guilt. If he swallowed cleanly, innocence. The act was seen as sacred, for the Eucharist itself was sometimes used, ensuring that God's body would not allow itself to be profaned by the mouth of a liar. Imagine the trembling hands, the dry throat, the desperate prayers as a man's fate hung on a single bite of bread. These trials were not spectacles of cruelty alone, they were drenched in ritual. The iron was blessed, the water consecrated, the food sanctified. Priests prayed solemnly, calling on the Almighty to reveal truth. Crowds gathered in awe, not as spectators of punishment, but as witnesses of a miracle. When the verdict came, few doubted its truth. To them, heaven had spoken. Modern eyes might recoil at such practices, calling them superstition or cruelty, but for medieval men and women, they were the only path to true justice. In a society where false oaths and forged testimony could sway human judges, the ordeal offered a trial beyond manipulation, or so they believed. Even the accused sometimes welcomed it, convinced that God would defend them if their hearts were pure. Yet beneath this awe lay a fragile truth. Human hands still prepared the fire, still blessed the water, still proclaimed the verdict. Was God truly deciding, or were men merely cloaking their judgments in divine robes? To the medieval mind, the question scarcely arose. To them, every burn, every swallow, every plunge into water was nothing less than the will of God, his court on earth, his justice made visible. The flames leapt high, crackling in the wind, as the iron bar glowed brighter and brighter, a molten orange against the dark of the hearth. The villagers pressed close, the priest's voice rising above the hiss of fire as he invoked God's name. For the accused, this was the moment when heaven itself would decide his fate. No clever argument could save him now, no silver-tongued advocate. Only the judgment of fire, the holiest of ordeals, stood between him and damnation. The ordeal by fire was perhaps the most awe-inspiring of all medieval trials. To carry a bar of burning iron across a set distance, or to plunge one's hand into a cauldron of boiling water, was to submit one's body to agony in the faith that God would protect the innocent. The ritual was exact, precise. The iron was weighed, the length of the walk measured, the number of steps counted with solemn care. Once the deed was done, the wounds were bound, sealed with wax by the priest, and left untouched for 3 days. Then, before the gathered community, the bandages were removed. If the flesh showed signs of clean healing, innocence was declared. If it festered with pus and rot, guilt had been revealed. Imagine the silence of the crowd as the iron was lifted from the fire, glowing so brightly it hurt the eyes. Imagine the accused, his lips murmuring prayers, his hands shaking as he prepared to grasp it. Every gasp of the onlookers, every chant of the priest, every hiss of flame was filled with the weight of eternity. When he lifted the iron, some villagers cried aloud, others crossed themselves. To them, it was not simply pain, it was the hand of God, testing the soul through the flesh. The ordeal was brutal, yes, but it was also sacred theater. It reminded all who watched that no sin escaped divine notice. The villagers who saw the accused carry the iron carried home a lesson with them. Live justly, fear God, for he sees all and judges all. In this sense, the ordeal was not only punishment or proof, it was moral instruction, burned into memory as deeply as iron scorched flesh. But one must ask, how many wounds healed, not because of innocence, but because of chance, or the skill of priests in tending them? How many innocent hands festered in filth, condemning the blameless to death? And how many guilty men walked free because their wounds happened to close clean? For the medieval crowd, these questions rarely mattered. To them, God's will was unquestionable. If the flesh healed, it was heaven's sign. If it rotted, it was the punishment of sin. Yet behind this awe lay human calculation. Priests sometimes chose the severity of the ordeal. How hot the iron, how long the distance, how deep the cauldron. Did mercy or bias influence their decisions? Could loyalty or bribes soften God's fire? Though cloaked in ritual, the ordeal by fire was never free of human touch, and in that touch lay the possibility of manipulation. Still, for centuries the ordeal endured, carried out in villages and cities alike, a spectacle that both terrified and reassured. For the guilty, it was dread incarnate. For the innocent, it was hope. And for the people as a whole, it was proof that God was not distant but present, his justice burning visibly before their eyes. So when we speak of medieval fire, we speak not only of heat and flame, but of faith, that searing conviction that heaven itself bent low to judge mankind. And though the smoke has long since faded, the memory of those trials lingers, a reminder of a world where men entrusted their lives to the judgment of fire, believing they held not iron, but the very hand of God. The river was silent, its surface broken only by the faint ripple of wind as the villagers gathered on its banks. The accused stood bound at wrist and ankle, trembling beneath the gaze of priest and lord alike. Before him lay no courtroom, no jury of peers, only water. Yet to the medieval mind, this water was no ordinary stream. It had been blessed, consecrated, transformed into the vessel of God's judgment. In a moment, it would decide whether the man before them was innocent or damned. The ordeal by water was among the most haunting of medieval trials. It carried with it a symbolism both simple and terrifying. Water, pure and holy, would accept the innocent into its embrace, pulling them down into its depths. The guilty, however, would be rejected, floating like refuse upon the surface. It was the most paradoxical of judgments. Life itself seemed to be weighed against the truth. To sink, even to death, was vindication. To float, survival, meant condemnation. Imagine the fear in the eyes of the accused as ropes tightened, as prayers were spoken over his bowed head. The priest would raise his hand, calling on the Almighty to reveal the truth through the purity of his creation. Then, with the murmurs of the crowd swelling, the man was cast into the water. Gasps rose as his body struck the surface. Did he sink quickly, bubbles rushing upward as water swallowed him whole? Did he bob upon the surface, flailing against the ropes? For the villagers, each movement was a sign from heaven, each ripple an echo of God's voice. This ordeal was most often invoked in accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, or heresy. Those who consorted with demons, it was said, could not be received by holy water. Witches would float, their very bodies betraying their pact with the devil. Countless women, accused by whispers or grudges, were bound and thrown into rivers, their lives and reputations hanging on whether they sank or swam. Some drowned as innocents, their deaths recorded with solemnity as martyrs to divine justice. Others floated and were dragged ashore, condemned to fire or gallows as servants of darkness. Yet beyond the horror there was ritual. Priests blessed the water, villagers sang hymns, and lords proclaimed the ordeal in the name of law. It was no mere drowning, it was liturgy, a sacred rite where God himself was called upon to judge. To the medieval mind, it was not cruel but righteous, a necessary path to certainty in a world where lies could not be untangled by men alone. Still, even here the hand of man could tilt the scales. How tightly were the ropes bound? How buoyant was the accused's body? Did those casting him into the river hold him beneath the surface a moment too long? Behind the solemnity of ritual lurked the possibility of manipulation, whether deliberate or unconscious. Yet few dared question the outcome, for to doubt the ordeal was to doubt God. The paradox of the ordeal by water lingers even now, that to die sinking was to be free, and to survive floating was to be guilty. In this inversion lay the very essence of medieval justice, truth revealed not through reason, but through mystery, a justice that confounds the living in order to serve the eternal. And so rivers and ponds became courts, their ripples carrying the weight of judgment. For those who gathered on the banks, it was not the accused they watched, but God, rendering his verdict through the cold embrace of water. The clash of steel rang louder than church bells, echoing across the lists where nobles and peasants alike gathered to witness God's justice in motion. Two men stood facing each other, armored and armed, their eyes locked in a glare that was more than hatred, it was desperation. This was no tournament for glory, no duel for honor alone. This was a trial, a holy test, and the belief was unshakable. The innocent would prevail, for heaven would guide his arm. The guilty would fall, struck down not only by his foe, but by divine judgment. Trial by combat was both spectacle and sacrament. It began not with the raising of swords, but with oaths sworn upon relics, saints, or the very Gospels themselves. Each combatant declared before God and men that his cause was just, calling down damnation upon himself if he lied. Priests blessed the field, sprinkling holy water upon the ground, as though consecrating a battlefield of faith. To the watching crowd, the arena became a court, the clash of weapons, the verdict, the victor's triumph, the voice of heaven itself. This ordeal was not reserved for knights alone. Peasants accused of theft, merchants in disputes, even widows defending their claims, could demand or be forced into combat by proxy. Sometimes champions were hired, men who fought in another's stead, swearing before God that they bore the truth. Whether noble or common, all believed the same. God's hand would guide the righteous to victory. The fights themselves were brutal and unforgiving. Unlike tournaments bound by rules of chivalry, trial by combat ended only with death or surrender. A knight might be battered from his horse and beaten senseless with a mace. A peasant might stagger, exhausted, beneath the blows of an opponent stronger and better armed. The crowd roared not as spectators of sport, but as witnesses to judgment, convinced that every strike was weighed upon the scales of heaven. But was it truly so? Did God always favor the innocent, or did the strong simply crush the weak? Historians tell of countless cases where truth and falsehood mattered less than swordsmanship and stamina. A guilty man could win by sheer skill. A blameless man could perish from exhaustion. Yet the people rarely doubted. A victor stood triumphant, hailed not only as the stronger fighter, but as the chosen of God. The loser's corpse was left as proof of guilt, his death accepted as divine verdict. Kings and lords, too, exploited this belief. They sanctioned trial by combat to settle disputes too tangled for courts or councils. Land, inheritance, even questions of treason were resolved not by parchment and seal, but by blood. Monarchs stood as judges, overseeing duels that decided the fate of entire estates or noble families. And as each fighter bled and fell, the king could declare that justice had been served not by his decree, but by the Almighty's hand. Yet the ritual was never free of manipulation. Who chose the weapons? Who declared the terms? Who ensured the field was fair? Even within the sanctity of trial by combat, men's ambitions and schemes seep through. A weaker combatant might be forced into the lists, knowing he could not prevail, his death orchestrated as a form of legal murder. Still, cloaked in ritual and belief, it was accepted as lawful and divine. For centuries, trial by combat persisted, weaving itself into the fabric of medieval law and culture. It was brutal, often unjust, yet strangely comforting in its simplicity. In a world where truth was elusive and evidence scarce, combat seemed the surest way to let God decide. And so, with swords drawn and shields raised, men wagered not only their lives but their eternal souls upon the battlefield of justice. While fire, water, and combat carried the raw drama of God's immediate judgment, another form of justice shaped medieval life with quieter but no less terrifying authority: the courts of the church. If kings ruled men's bodies, the church ruled their souls. And nowhere was this more evident than in canon law, the vast system of rules and judgments that reached from Rome into every village in Christendom. Step inside a cathedral chapter house where a bishop presides, or into a small parish hall where a priest sits in judgment, and you will find justice draped in the robes of heaven. Here, disputes over marriage, inheritance, adultery, heresy, and even promises broken were brought before the clergy. Unlike the ordeals of flame and flood, these courts sought not spectacle, but authority-written decrees, solemn hearings, verdicts pronounced with the weight of eternal damnation hovering over them. At their heart lay the belief that the church alone held the keys to salvation, and thus it must guard the moral fabric of society. Marriage, for instance, was not just a contract between man and woman, but a sacrament, a covenant before God. To abandon a spouse, to wed unlawfully, to deny conjugal duty, these were sins, and the courts of the church stood ready to enforce God's law. For nobles, disputes over inheritance often wound their way through these courts, for only the church could declare a marriage valid or illegitimate, and thus determine the fate of entire estates. But the greatest fear came in matters of heresy. To be accused of defying the church's teaching was to stand at the edge of a spiritual abyss. Trials of heresy were conducted with solemnity, interrogations cloaked in ritual, confessions demanded as proof of contrition. Punishments ranged from pilgrimage and penance to excommunication, the dreaded cutting off from the body of Christ. To be excommunicated was not merely to lose the comfort of the church, but to be cast adrift from community, cursed in life and in death, denied Christian burial, damned in the eyes of all. The church's courts carried a power that no king's tribunal could rival, the authority to bind and to loose in the name of God. While monarchs wielded swords, bishops wielded sacraments. A peasant might survive a lord's wrath, but to be condemned by the church was to risk the eternal fire of hell. No punishment could terrify more deeply, for it pierced beyond life into the afterlife itself. And yet, like all human systems, these courts could be twisted. Bishops and abbots were not immune to ambition, nor priests to bias. At times, trials served the interests of powerful families or silenced political enemies. Land could be seized, fortunes redirected, reputations destroyed, all under the pretense of divine law. For the poor, the church's courts could feel like distant forces, wielded by priests who were as much lords as shepherds. Still, it would be unjust to see these courts only as instruments of tyranny. They also offered protection. Widows appealed for their rights, orphans found guardianship, Servants sought justice when lords mistreated them. In many cases, the church's courts provided a voice for the voiceless, applying laws rooted in morality rather than brute power. For some, they were the only refuge from the harsh arbitrariness of feudal justice. Thus, the church's tribunals stood as both beacon and burden, promising the justice of God, yet carried out by the hands of men. They claimed to speak with the authority of heaven, to bind sin and free the penitent, yet they could also serve the ambitions of those who presided within them. To walk into such a court was to stand before the throne of judgment itself, uncertain whether one faced the mercy of Christ or the designs of men cloaked in holy robes. Beneath the solemn chants, the sacred blessings, and the trembling awe of the crowds, there lurked a darker truth. Justice in the name of God was not always the voice of heaven. Often, it was the whisper of ambition, the roar of politics, the cold calculation of men who discovered that by cloaking their will in divine robes, they could command obedience no sword could win. God's justice, so holy in its promise, was sometimes twisted into a weapon. Consider the ordeals. Who chose how hot the iron must burn, or how far the accused must carry it? Who decided how tightly ropes were tied before the accused was cast into the river? Though villagers were told that God alone decided the outcome, it was human hands that set the terms. A sympathetic priest might bless cooler iron, or bind ropes loosely, giving the accused a chance. A hostile lord might order harsher conditions, ensuring the man's doom. To the crowd, it looked like God's will. In truth, it was the will of men veiled in sacred ritual. The church courts, too, were fertile ground for manipulation. A powerful bishop might condemn a rival noble as heretic, stripping him of land in the name of purity. A wealthy merchant might bribe clerics to secure a favorable ruling in disputes. Even kings learned the value of excommunication not as a weapon of faith, but as a tool of politics. To be cut off from the church was to be ruined, and those who controlled that fate controlled nations. Perhaps the most chilling examples came during witch hunts and heresy trials. A woman accused of witchcraft might be the victim of envy, a neighbor's grudge, or the greed of officials eager to seize her land. Once the charge was leveled, the machinery of God's justice ground inexorably forward. Interrogation, forced confession, condemnation. By the time flames devoured her body, the crowd saw only a sinner punished by heaven, never suspecting the earthly motives that had guided the trial from the start. Even kings wrapped their ambitions in divine justice. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he carried a papal banner claiming God's blessing for his conquest. His victory was not merely a triumph of arms, but, in the eyes of chroniclers, the judgment of God. By wielding heaven's name, he turned war into righteousness, rebellion into heresy. Every crown seized, every land annexed, could be painted not as theft, but as the unfolding of divine will. This manipulation was powerful because belief was absolute. To doubt a verdict was to doubt God. Villagers dared not question why the innocent sometimes burned or why the guilty sometimes walked free. Nobles hesitated to challenge excommunications for fear of eternal damnation. Even the victims often accepted their fate, convinced that if God had allowed their condemnation, then it must be just. Faith itself became the perfect mask for human ambition. And yet, cracks appeared. Chronicles record murmurs of discontent, whispers that perhaps not all verdicts bore the stamp of heaven. When rival popes excommunicated each other during the Great Schism, ordinary people began to ask, could God truly condemn two men at once? When kings clashed with the papacy, branding one another's decrees as lies, doubts spread like shadows. Slowly, painfully, the illusion of uncorrupted divine justice began to fade. Still, for centuries, manipulation thrived, hidden behind incense and ritual. The beauty of medieval faith was also its danger. Belief was so strong that it gave immense power to those who claimed to speak for God. In the end, God's justice was not always God's. It was too often the justice of men, sharpened into a blade, gilded with holiness, and wielded against the weak. The square was filled with smoke, the acrid scent of burning flesh mingling with the prayers of the crowd. A woman shrieked as the flames rose around her, her cries echoing against the stone walls until they broke into silence. The priest raised a hand, declaring that God's justice had been served, that a witch had been purged from Christendom. Yet among the villagers, some wept, some turned away, and some whispered the unthinkable. What if she had been innocent? The Middle Ages was an age of faith, but it was also an age of tragedy. Beneath the rituals and the solemn proclamations, countless innocents suffered, condemned not by God, but by the prejudices and ambitions of men. Trials by ordeal, courts of the church, and public executions all promised certainty. Yet their verdicts were not always truth. They were verdicts of flesh and fear, and often it was the blameless who bore the punishment. Consider the peasants accused of petty theft or blasphemy, who found themselves forced to carry burning iron or plunge their hands into boiling water. Infection was common, wounds rarely healed cleanly, and even the innocent often failed heaven's cruel test. To the watching crowd, festering wounds meant guilt, but to us they mean only that human bodies cannot escape the laws of nature. How many died condemned as liars when their only crime was poor health or bad luck? Women bore the heaviest burden. In villages haunted by famine or struck by sudden illness, suspicion often fell on widows, healers, or simply those who lived on the fringes of society. Whispered accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire. Once named, a woman's fate was nearly sealed. Dragged before priests, bound and thrown into rivers, or choked on consecrated bread, she was doomed not by her deeds, but by fear itself. To survive these ordeals was nearly impossible. To fail was proof enough of guilt. Many innocent women met their end in fire or water, their cries lost in the roar of the crowd's conviction. Even nobles and kings could fall prey to this twisted justice. Rivals accused one another of heresy or treason, forcing duels where the weaker, often not the guiltier, perished beneath sword or mace. Entire estates were seized, families ruined, all under the guise of God's will. A victor's triumph was hailed as proof of righteousness, even when it was nothing more than brute strength or political manipulation. The losers, some innocent, some guilty, were swallowed by earth and memory alike, their names cursed for eternity. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that the condemned often accepted their fate. To believe in God's justice so deeply was to believe that even wrongful suffering must serve His plan. A man burned as a heretic might cry out in despair, but many also whispered prayers as the flames consumed them, begging for mercy, convinced that if God allowed their death, it was part of His judgment. Innocence or guilt mattered little when faith demanded submission to whatever outcome heaven or its earthly servants declared. Chroniclers record haunting stories of the innocent undone. A boy accused of stealing bread and cast into a pond, where he drowned as proof of his purity. A young woman declared guilty of sorcery after floating in consecrated water, though all she had done was care for the sick with herbs. A knight slain in combat after swearing his truth before God, leaving behind only his widow's bitter grief. These stories are rare in the records, but their silence speaks louder. History remembers the verdicts of the powerful, not the innocence of the condemned. And so, the question gnaws at us across the centuries. How could a society so devoted to God condemn so many blameless souls? The answer lies in the paradox of medieval justice. It was a system built on faith, yet corrupted by human fear, ignorance, and ambition. To the people of the Middle Ages, every verdict was heaven's will. To us, it is a reminder of the cost when men claim to speak for God without question. By the dawn of the 13th century, whispers began to stir across Christendom. Whispers that the ordeals of fire and water, so long believed to bear God's verdict, might not be the voice of heaven after all. The wounds of the innocent festered, the guilty sometimes walked free, and doubt so dangerous in an age of faith crept into the minds of priests, kings, and scholars alike. Slowly, painfully, the medieval world began to move away from trials that called directly upon God and toward courts where evidence, inquiry, and testimony began to matter. The turning point came with the Church itself. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, one of the most important gatherings of the medieval Church, Pope Innocent III forbade clergy from blessing the instruments of ordeal. Without the consecration of priests, the fire and water could no longer claim divine authority. This decision struck at the heart of Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. For the first time in centuries, the Church officially stepped back, declaring that heaven's justice should not be summoned by flame or flood. Kings and rulers, too, began to recognize the limits of ordeal. Some monarchs saw the danger in entrusting justice to rituals that could as easily discredit them as confirm their power. Others saw opportunity in developing more centralized systems of law, ones that strengthened royal authority rather than leaving verdicts to chance or to the whim of priests. In England, King Henry III and later monarchs expanded the role of juries, moving gradually toward trials that relied on sworn testimony rather than miracles of fire and water. This shift was not immediate. For many villages, ordeals had been woven into the very fabric of justice, and abandoning them left a void. Into that void stepped new practices: the use of written records, the rise of inquests, the slow growth of evidence-based proceedings. Local juries of men sworn to truth began to replace the iron and the river. These jurors, drawn from the community, weighed disputes with human judgment rather than divine spectacle. Justice became less dramatic, but more rational. Yet even as ordeals declined, their ghost lingered. Trial by combat remained in use for centuries longer, defended by nobles who clung to the belief that God revealed his will through the clash of arms. Heresy trials, too, retained echoes of divine ordeal, with accused men and women subjected to interrogations that sought not evidence but confessions of sin. The old belief that God directly guided justice was not easily erased. Even as new systems arose, the decline of ordeals also reflected the slow dawn of a new intellectual age. Universities were spreading across Europe, teaching canon law, Roman law, and philosophy. Scholars debated justice not as a mystical act of heaven, but as a rational system that could be studied, organized, and codified. Aristotle was translated, Roman legal texts rediscovered, and the idea that law could be built on reason rather than miracle began to take hold. For the common people, however, this change was bittersweet. The ordeal had been brutal, but it was also immediate and certain. One carried the iron, one faced the water, and the truth, whether by miracle or by misfortune, was known within days. The new courts were slower, more complicated, and often more distant. Justice became a matter for officials and records, not the village square, where once all could witness God's verdict. Now judgments were hidden in parchment and sealed with wax. Still, the tide could not be turned back. By the 14th century, ordeals were largely memories, remembered in chronicles and legends, whispered of as relics of a harsher, holier age. In their place stood courts that resembled something closer to our own, flawed, human, yet striving for reason rather than miracle. The voice of God grew quieter in the halls of justice, replaced by the voices of men debating, questioning, and judging. Yet the central question remained: had justice grown closer to truth, or had men only stripped away the veil of heaven to reveal their own ambitions more clearly? For in abandoning ordeals, Europe was not abandoning the search for justice, it was merely exchanging one kind of faith for another. The image of a trembling man clutching burning iron, of a bound woman sinking into a river, of two armored knights clashing until one lay dead. All these linger like ghosts when we ask the final question: did God truly rule justice in the Middle Ages, or did men merely pretend in his name? For centuries, people believed with unshakable conviction that heaven itself reached down into every trial, every verdict. Yet when we look closer, we see not only faith but fear, not only divine mystery but human ambition. To the medieval mind, there was little room for doubt. God was present in every corner of life, His will woven into plague and harvest, war and peace, guilt and innocence. To entrust justice to Him seemed not only reasonable but necessary. Who else could pierce through lies and secrets? Who else could know the truth hidden in human hearts? Fire and water, bread and combat, these were not accidents of chance but instruments through which the Almighty spoke. To reject them would have been to reject the very order of the world. And yet, human hands controlled every detail. Priests blessed the flames, lords enforced the ordeals, judges declared the verdicts, kings and popes wielded excommunication not as divine curse, but as political weapon. Women accused of witchcraft, peasants condemned for theft, nobles destroyed by duels. How many were victims not of God's judgment, but of envy, greed, or fear, disguised as piety? The sacred rituals that promised truth could as easily conceal injustice. The tragedy is not only that innocent suffered, but that they often believed their suffering just. Faith so deep could make a man accept the rope, the flame, the blade, convinced that even wrongful death was part of God's plan. That very conviction gave immense power to those who claimed to speak for heaven. In their hands, justice became both holy and dangerous, a force that could console the weak but also crush them. Yet we must not dismiss these practices as mere superstition. They reflect a society desperately seeking certainty in a world of chaos. In an age without science, without modern law, without the safeguards we take for granted, ordeals offered clarity. Brutal though they were, they gave people assurance that justice was not abandoned to men's whims, but anchored in the eternal will of God. Perhaps it was this yearning for fairness, rather than cruelty, that kept faith in ordeals alive for so long. By the time ordeals faded, and juries, records, and evidence replaced them, the illusion of divine justice had given way to human judgment. But even in this shift, the shadow of God remained. Oaths were still sworn on the Bible, trials still framed as moral struggles, justice still invoked heaven's authority. The divine crown was never fully set aside, only hidden beneath the robes of reason and law. So, did God truly rule medieval justice? Perhaps the answer lies in paradox. In faith, yes, for the people of that age believed He did, and their lives were shaped by that belief. In fact, perhaps not, for men always held the ropes, the irons, the swords, and men always bent outcomes to serve their needs. Justice in the Middle Ages was both divine and human, a strange marriage of belief and manipulation. And in that marriage lies the enduring lesson. When justice claims to speak with the voice of heaven, we must always ask whose voice it truly is. For the Middle Ages remind us that justice, whether wrapped in fire or written on parchment, is never free from the touch of those who wield it. God may be the eternal judge, but on earth, men too often pretend to sit in His seat.